Good morning. It's so good to see everybody today. It's exciting to be together. If you open your Bibles to the passage that was read for us, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 is where we will spend most of our time this morning. Before we begin, there's one thing that I want to alert everyone to. You guys are killing me. The word is boasting. The gospel of boasting. So there. All right. One thing I want to mention to you is this evening David is going to be preaching. And I have already read his outline, and you need to hear this. He taught me things just reading the outline that I never thought of. And they are things that everyone here needs to hear. So please, rub your hands together and go, oh goody, I need to come and hear this. I know I just put a whole bunch of pressure on David, but he'll do fine. But it'll be something that is very, very important for all of us, for the church and for each of us individually. When I was a young preacher, I asked an older preacher a question about a passage in 1 Corinthians. And he looked down at me over his glasses and said, "You know, young man, that's the milk of the word." And I sheepishly said, "Yes, sir, I know, but I still don't understand that text. Would you help me?" And all these years later, I still recognize that, as Paul said in chapter 3 and verse 1 and 2, I could not speak to you as to spiritual men, but I had to speak to you as babes, as those who need milk and not strong meat. Indeed, there's a lot of truth to that as you would read 1 Corinthians, and maybe it is the reason we spend so much time studying it, because we really like it. It's simple. It's easy to go, rah, rah, those people really blew it, and to see all the things that need to be corrected. However, a more careful study of especially connecting 1 Corinthians with 2 Corinthians, because they are deeply connected, reveals a number of questions that are not quickly answered as we might think. Especially when we realize that when we spend 3 to 6 months, and even longer at times, in studying both of those letters, that at the end we have each week just concentrated on this one little section, and that is, of course, the challenge of study as it is in a collective group, in which we are focused on this one little section, this one little section, this one little section, and pretty soon it is very easy to miss the broader message. So what I want to do this morning, and also, Lord willing, next week, is to look more carefully at the broader messages, because when we miss this broader message in favor of, well, you need to fix this, Corinthians, you need to fix this, you need to fix this, and we go through and study it that way, we miss what Paul's real point is. And we also miss what is the real problem that the Corinthians are struggling with. We might say, well, they're struggling with with a lack of unity. Well, they're struggling with, suing each other, and they're struggling with sexual immorality, and yeah. We all know that backwards and forwards, but that is not the real problem. And that's what we want to really look like. In fact, it is interesting to me that we as Christians, and I'm not pointing my finger at you particularly, but across the world, across the brotherhood, across every kind of religion, I find that the knowledge of 1 Corinthians is far greater than the knowledge of 2 Corinthians. As a matter of fact, 2 Corinthians is very often just avoided and thrown to the wind, because somebody says, well, it's just Paul defending his apostleship, and we all believe Paul's an apostle, so why should I study it anyway? Which is all erroneous. And even if it were true, it wouldn't mean you wouldn't study it, as if God gave it only to the Corinthians and not to the rest of us. That's silliness. But what we need to understand is we can come, and I have come many times, to the realization, the uncomfortable realization, that in many ways we too are babes. And we too are those whom Paul needed to speak to as people of the flesh, as he said, as those who are in need of the spiritual milk that Paul is giving the Corinthians. And I think you'll readily see this as we then scope back and go to the 30,000 foot level, so to speak, and take a look at really what the problem the Corinthians had and how they were being affected by Paul's message. So we look at three different points here in this broader message, and that is, what is the real problem at Corinth? Not what are these individual things that need to be corrected, but what is the real problem at Corinth? And secondly, how is the Corinthian culture affecting the Corinthian Christian and bringing about these problems? And unless we say, oh yes, that Corinthian culture was terrible, well, ours is wonderful, isn't it? We're just all together. No, our culture affects us deeply as well, and it's just blindness on our part to not realize how much our culture affects us. All the way from the social media to the television to the movies and just to relationships in general, and children in schools that often are not doing what they should do, etc. We even if the school's doing wonderful, you've got a pile of kids who aren't. And so you got to deal with that. There's just all kinds of things that are going on here that we need to understand. And then thirdly, how does this message solve major problems within churches today? And so that's what that is going to be our focus this morning, and also our focus, as I said, Lord willing, next week. So let's begin then with this. What is this real problem? Now, if I ask you the question, well, tell me the main theme of 1 Corinthians, or even the main theme of the Corinthian letters. And as I said, they're deeply connected. If I said, just give me a 2-sentence summary, what is the theme of the Corinthian letters? Well, that would be a real challenge for a lot of people, because a lot of times what we would say, well, it's Paul answering the problems and correcting the things that the Corinthians are messed up with, all the way from unity to envy to jealousy to exalting other teachers over someone else, just an entirely flawed number of doctrinal beliefs that they had going for them. And yet, Paul had only left there about 3.5 years previous to this letter. And so quickly things have devolved into this particular condition. And someone might even answer and say, well, there really isn't a main theme. It is just a letter in which Paul has to correct them on all these things. But there's certainly, while truth in the fact that Paul is correcting these things, as I said, we're missing the real message. And we're missing the actual problem that the Corinthians are dealing with. So how do we discover a message? How do we discover a message of the text? Why don't we take a deviation just for a second and say, when you're reading and studying your Bible, how would you discover a message instead of just focusing on little sections all the way through? What would be the theme of that letter? And that is something that every Christian should have a focus and a goal to do with all 66 books, and be able to just go, oh yeah, if you say Zechariah, I can tell you what the focus, or I can tell you what the theme is. That should be what we want to do. So how are we going to discover that? Well, there's two simple ways. There'll be some other things involved. But there's two simple ways, and the first would be that we want to just look at the beginning and we want to do a quick cursory read through and look at the beginning and the end of the book. Just like any speech, how does the preacher start and how does he end? What is his conclusion? What did he tell us he was doing, about to do, and how did that bring to an end? And the preachers of the New Testament do the exact same thing. And the other thing we want to look at is what are these repeated phrases in this letter? Like if you thought of Leviticus and you say, what is a key word that's used a whole bunch of times? Everybody here, I'm sure, would say holiness. Exactly, 96 times in the letter, holiness. And that is the message that you keep getting throughout the book of Leviticus. So when we look at the Corinthian letters, what then is the message and how can we put that together? Let's put it this way. For Paul to have only given, and just think of this reasonably, for Paul to only give the do's and don'ts and corrections of what a church is doing in a letter, is that really God's end goal in our lives? Unfortunately, it is the way we have studied historically. The 20th century is not a fond memory for me when it comes to spiritual investigation, because most of the teaching and preaching was here's what's right and here's what's wrong. And most of our study then was taught to us to discover, when we personally studied, here's what's right and here's what's wrong. Amazingly, I've talked to many Christians, and I totally said, I understand, I agree. In which they said, all of my study, my whole life is just to discover what to do that's right and what not to do that's wrong, and to stay away from the false teaching and do what the good teaching is. And all of my life has been to do that. And I realized that all of that never taught me who God is, and was not the equivalent to knowing God. So it is inappropriate to take the Corinthian letters and say, Paul's just correcting things. He's just giving us the do's and don'ts and what ought to be done. And instead, what God is actually doing, and what Paul is doing in this letter, is he embeds underneath that a message that goes all the way through, that is to transform us. If you only know the rights and wrongs and the do's and don'ts, you will not be transformed. You will go from the surface level. It will not be embedded in your heart. God will not be embedded, and the pleasing of God will not be embedded in your heart. And the love of God will not be embedded in your heart. Just because you know the speed limit doesn't mean you love the one who put it there. God's looking for more than that. And Paul delivers on that, obviously. We knew full well that he would. So this is where there are two primary words in the book, in the books, in the letters, that go all the way through the letters, and they're the emphasis of the letters. One is the word boasting, which we're going to talk about this morning, and one is the word gospel. You say, well, we've already done a lot of lessons on gospel. I know we have, but we're going to look at it from the Corinthian point of view and some other things. That will just be one. But those two words are throughout this book, and the messages of those two words are throughout the book. So let's talk this morning just about this idea of boast or boasting. The word, in its various forms, are used 32 times in these two letters. Imagine. A word that Paul disdains in most of the text. As far as any human boasting, he uses it 32 times in these two letters. It bookends the message. He begins in chapter 1, 29 through 31, as Jacob just read for us about boasting, and then it is concluded in chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Corinthians, in which Paul spends a greater amount of time showing the foolishness of boasting and ridiculing. I love how he does that, but ridiculing the false teachers for their boasting by himself boasting in how much he's gotten beat up. How funny it is to see Paul's little subtleness that is about as subtle as a 2x4 as he goes through that. So the thing that comes to our mind, obviously, immediately is, what does boasting have to do with us? We're just the lowlives of, the community world. What does boasting have to do with us? I'm going to suggest to you that human beings simply don't hardly live without some boasting. We can't extricate ourselves from some kind of boasting. It is part and parcel with life. I'm believing really that God has placed in us the desire for someone to say, look at him and how he did that. You see it all the time in athletes. I've always cringed when an athlete said, they weren't respecting me. I need some respect out here on this field, and they weren't respecting me. So I had to punch him in the mouth, or whatever. You're like, oh, get over it. But humans do that. Just to illustrate. We even boast in our illnesses. We even boast when we get hurt. Somebody says, oh man, I got up and fell out of bed last night. Oh, really hurt. Somebody else says, that's nothing. I got up one night and fell all the way down the stairs and broke both my wrists. Somebody says, I wish that's all that happened to me. I fell off a roof. And how many times I got up to play golf and the other guy goes, you want to see my x-rays? Just to get a better handicap. We just got to one-up someone. We even do that, boasting in our illnesses, much less boasting in our accomplishments. So Paul explains this in chapter 1, 17 through chapter 2, verse 5, which Jacob has read the primary point of that. But what I want you to see here is the principles that Paul teaches in this text are incredibly important for today's church. They're incredibly important for us as well. I want you to concentrate just especially first and foremost and primarily on in verse 17 when Paul says, Christ did not send me to baptize. Now remember what he's doing is exalting, these Christians are exalting one teacher over another, and this one's more eloquent than that one and all this. And he says, I'm just thankful I didn't baptize most of you. He says, I don't want anybody, exalting themselves because I'm the one that happened to dunk you. And he says, he didn't have me to come and preach baptism, but to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Not with words of eloquent wisdom. The question immediately arises, what's wrong with seeking to preach impressively? What's wrong with seeking to teach in an eloquent way? Well, even Apollos was said to be an eloquent speaker and preacher. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, this is a misunderstanding of the Corinthian culture. When you look at these two texts and compare these two texts, you can see Paul in verse 17 of chapter 1 talking about eloquent words with eloquent wisdom. When you look at chapter 2, he says in verse 1, and I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God. Notice the words, with lofty speech or wisdom. And then, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ, him crucified, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Notice how many times he mentions this lofty speech, lofty wisdom, the idea of plausible words of wisdom. What is the difference here? And here is where he makes the end point in verse 4 that we want to keep in our mind. The reason he didn't come speaking that way was so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. There's the conclusion of the whole text that comes down through to that particular point. Where is your faith resting? In the wisdom of men or in the power of God? So the attack is on the preacher himself. And we could go on and say, well, it just doesn't make sense to us that we would disdain somebody who's a great speaker. Well, you don't really understand the Corinthian culture. So in the Corinthian culture is much different in some ways than our culture. Who are the most famous in our culture? Well, they're the actors and actresses, and they're the great athletes, and they're the great musicians. Then it's not exactly the way it was in the Corinthian culture. In the Corinthian culture, it was the sophists or the great speakers, those who were individuals who gave great rhetorical and philosophical speeches. They were the ones who were listed up. They were the ones who had the big money. They were the ones who got the big contracts, so to speak. If there was a television today, they would be the ones who are being promoted over and again and being on the talk shows. These were those individuals. And it's interesting, they're referred to as sophists because the Greek word for wisdom is Sophia, or Sophia. And so this is how they were referred to. So to get a good idea of what they were like, here is the way this was understood in the first century. Debating and giving flashy speeches were both a science and an art and a polished skill that required sharp wit, deep knowledge, impeccable logic, stylish use of words, and fiery passion. This was the ingredients of the goal of the sophist, because in doing that, he could demand greater money and greater wages. In fact, what is pointed out is that the content of their speech was in many ways not nearly as important as the way that they expressed themselves and put out that content. And so they had a convolution of being able to entertain the audience well at the same time of imparting certain message or content. Now we're told also that they were nowhere near an Aristotle at the first century, nowhere near an Aristotle or a Plato or the earlier ones in the Greek fashion and Greek history. It had devolved into something that was more entertaining than it was something that had substance. Well, the key, obviously, then, to the sophist, and most of us have known this before, was to increase their social standing and get them to the point where they could demand more money. And the more popular they were, the more money they could demand. And there was a situation in which you had leaders and speakers, and then you had clients and those who would support them and give them honor and give them glory. And that was the way things went in. And it parallels, as you could see, much of today's kind of preaching. Sometimes we call it the gospel of health and wealth, and real fancy speakers, and they draw big crowds and things like this. Well, here's what comes to our mind. Well, don't great speakers draw listeners? Aren't we trying to bring people in? Do we want them to hear the gospel message? Can't we just attract people to listen by super fantastic, eloquent speakers? There's all kinds of attempts, and I hear this over and over again lately in traveling with people talking about numerous types of attempts to draw more people. And that attitude is extremely dangerous. How can we draw more people? And it leads to not only the idea of using eloquent speech and eloquent wisdom and plausible words and all of that type of stuff in order to get people to attend. It isn't to say that it's wrong to have a speaker who does a good job teaching. That would be crazy. As I said, Paul said Apollos was great at that. That's not the idea. But there is an idea when it covers up Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Let's look at this more carefully. In 2 verse 1, Paul actually tells us that he did the very opposite of proclaiming the testimony of God with speech, with lofty speech or wisdom. He did the very opposite. He says, I determined not to come and do that to you. When he walked in and spoke to them and gave a lesson to them, it was so opposite those fancy sophists that in chapter 10, they said, man, he's a bad preacher. They were looking for something far greater. And the sophists themselves said, boy, his writing is really powerful and hard and difficult. His presence and his speech, black. It's terrible. Gives me the idea the Apostle Paul might not have been hired, quote unquote, from too many churches today. What are we looking for here? And in fact, he goes even further and he says, instead of giving some kind of bravado and walking in with boldness, I'm the Apostle Paul and I have come to fix this place, he says, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in trembling. And my message just didn't come with the plausible words of wisdom, but I just tried to demonstrate the power of the Spirit and the power of God in the words that He gave me to give you. That's what I tried to do. And then in 2 verse 2, he in fact said so much so that he says, I decided not to know anything among you but Jesus Christ, Him crucified. Do you understand that word, that phrase? How is it that Paul would understand nothing but Jesus Christ, Him crucified? What would that actually mean? And that's what we want to discover here for a second. Look, and if you turn to chapter 2 and verse 10, Paul explains that. He says, these things God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. Remember, he said, I just give you the demonstration of the Spirit and power. For who knows a person's thought except the spirit of the person who is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit is from God, that we might understand the things freely given to us by God. And then he says, here's how I preach to you. And we impart this in words, not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural person doesn't accept it. Paul says, here's what I did. I took the words of the Spirit and I imparted the words of the Spirit to you. I didn't come up with my own human wisdom. I didn't come up with my own fancy-dancy illustrations and things like this. I came up with what the Spirit gave me to deliver you. And I didn't use my own words. Wow. So in doing this, Paul is saying, I didn't want to know anything but Christ and Him crucified. Now that's the second thing that we need to understand a little more carefully here. This is where faith rests. It rests in what Jesus did on the cross. That's where faith rests. If you compare, and I mentioned this just a second ago in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, I want you to see this text here. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, as he describes, again, this speaking, verse 2, 2 Corinthians 10, I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. And turning the flesh means we're trying to equal them. I'm trying to speak like they speak. I'm trying to equal their fancy-dancy sophistry. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. We're not battling the way the flesh would battle. We're not trying to win a point the way the flesh would win a point. We're not trying to promote God the way the flesh would promote God. And we certainly aren't trying to promote ourselves. Verse 4, for what the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Our only job is to get everyone to take their every thought captive to Christ. That is our purpose. Now notice how this fits in our culture today. The challenge of every preacher is, are you counting on your own personal persuasiveness, your own personal combination of words, your own personal power in teaching, and your own personality to change the hearts of people? I remember as a young preacher, every time I taught someone and they didn't become a Christian, my thought was, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? I need to go back and look at the lesson I'm teaching. I need to figure out how to somehow put this out better. Now, obviously, no big harm in saying, can I deliver this better? Can I put the scriptures together better, etc.? But that wasn't the thought. The thought was, they didn't become a Christian, it was my mistake. And yet in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul said, we have this message in jars of clay, that the surpassing power may not be seen in us, but in God. For somebody who wants God, they don't need a fancy preacher. They don't need a fancy teacher. And that should wake every Christian up here. Jars of clay, broken pottery, is discovered and found in every excavation that there is. They're by the millions. And Paul called us just jars of clay. Study your Bible. Tell people about it. And it won't matter how smooth you are. It will only matter of whether or not they love God and they want God. So what is a preacher relying on? What is a speaker relying on? What is a teacher relying on? We must expect that who is the one who really transforms our lives? Is it me? Is it you? Or is it the power of actually knowing Jesus? Knowing Him in the way the Spirit imparted it. I heard a preacher recently while we were away. And the sermon puzzled me. There's very few text, a couple of times a quotation, but most of the sermon was about things that were biblical. Pop, 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 pop. We should be this, we should be this, we should be this, we should be this. This is where we're going, this is what we ought to do, this. And afterwards I was very puzzled. How did that, man, that was smooth. Something was not quite right. And I talked to my son Scott, who listened into, and I said, what was going on there? And he said, what you don't know is, that is a chapter in a book that I read, and he simply read it. I went, what? That helps me understand. It was man's way, if you might say, of explaining something that I never even saw in the text, and it was not brought up in the sermon. Now, it'd be one thing to say, look at this text. Let me see if I can help you understand the text. But that's not what happened. I don't blame the young man because he was a young man. And by the way, it's the reason don't preach without somebody experienced training you. That goes for you women too. How about that? You need help. We all need help and understanding. But this is the problem. Who gets the glory at the end? Who gets the glory when everything is about plausible words and fancy speaking and using one's personality to forcefully try to get people to make a change or to preach hard and say, you need to do this and you need to do that? Who is going to get the glory at the end? Are we going to walk away and say, wow, what a speaker? Or are we going to walk away and say, wow, what a Father? What a God? You might be wondering, why do I think this is important for you to know? Because one day I will be long gone. And I think this is the major issue that has gone on across Christianity. Just plain stop it and show us the Father. Use the artistic way the Spirit put this together. What a waste! What an absolute waste! If we're going to take about 5% of the Bible and just pull out little thoughts and quotes, but it all be based on how smooth. I always loved to listen to Melvin Curry. Great speaker. No, he wasn't. Powerful message. No, it wasn't. Get you in the text and show you God. Yes, it was. Woof. You never walked away and went, what a Melvin Curry that was. You walked away and said, what a God we serve. Homer Haley. Wow. I thought I'd just talk to you this morning about this text. And went, yeah. Great speaker. No, he wasn't. But when you went away, you were just blown away by the greatness of God. Show us the Father. Into what image will people be transformed when it is about how well we deliver, how fancy the words, how perfectly the thing was put together? What will people be transformed into? They'll be transformed into human glory, and they'll be nothing but a natural man, as he referred to them in chapter 2. Paul's greatest concern was the emptying of the cross of Christ of its power. And we need to see Christ and how He conquered and how we also are going to conquer. The Lord is saving people, not by this idolatry of worldly wisdom. You notice in that text, earlier in the text, when He says down in verse 26, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of us were wise according to the world's standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." You know, what is this worldly wisdom? Well, it's very simple. Oh, it reminds me of Naaman. Naaman's servants. Naaman pulls up with all his pomp and power and his leprosy at Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even bother to come out. He just sends his servant Gehazi out and says, "Go tell him to dip in the Jordan." Naaman goes away in a rage. "Well, I thought the prophet would come out, raise his hand, and call upon the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the leprous spot, and it would go away. Oh, that would be so glorious." Dip in the Jordan? Don't you know who I am? And Naaman's servants said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed?" That's the wisdom of the world. See, the wisdom of the world wants to exalt me. Wisdom of the world wants to give glory to me. Wisdom of the world says that when I get this and I accomplish this and I'm saved, everybody will go, "Yay, you!" That is not preaching Christ crucified. It's just man's glory. And finally, in verse 30, "And because of Him," look at that, "because of Him you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. And therefore let him who boast in the Lord." That comes out of Jeremiah 9, and they are about to have the Babylonians come in and destroy them. And God says, "Look, you boast in your wisdom, it's not going to make it. The mighty man cannot boast in his might, and the rich man cannot boast in his riches. Let him who boast in the Lord. Boast in this, that he knows me, that he understands me, and practices steadfast love and righteousness in the earth. These are the things in which the Lord delights." I just ask you, was Jerusalem destroyed in 586 BC or not? Yes, it was. Leveled. Why? They put their hope in their wisdom and their might and their riches. That's why. That is all man has, and none of it is permanent. Paul is teaching a deep connection between the gospel of Christ crucified and the message of the cross. That is, there's a contrast in living the wisdom of the world, in which I'm looking for my glory, and living the wisdom of the cross and the folly of what is preached. That if he was crucified, I also must be crucified. He determines how you live. And therefore Jesus said in Luke 14:26, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Second time, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Third time, "Therefore, anyone of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." Quit thinking about, I cannot be his disciple unless I'm baptized. Start thinking about this. That's the wisdom of God. And how we preach it is how we live it. That's the message of the cross. I may not have gotten that across as well as I would have liked, but it doesn't matter, you got it. Because that's the beauty of the text. We're going to sing a song right now. Any way we can help you, be glad to do so. And ask you to come forward or talk to us afterwards while together we stand and while we sing.